The very first step to having a successful build is being prepared. Now, this doesn't matter what scale of vehicle you're building or if it's nitro or electric. One of the biggest things that's often overlooked is your work surface. To begin, we want to start off with a clean work surface that's going to be undisturbed. We want to have an area where we can leave our kit, our tools, the parts overnight if we need to, because often you can't just build your RC and have everything done in one day. So if you're building your kit at like the kitchen dinner table, for instance, and you need to remove everything to eat dinner that night, it's going to be much more of a challenge to do that. You want to build somewhere where you can just leave it and not worry about everything. And on that work surface, it can be really helpful to put down like a pit mat or maybe an old towel you don't really care about getting dirty, and that'll just help protect the surface that you're working on. And also a pit mat or a towel will just help prevent any screws or any hardware or parts from falling off the table. And if you happen to be building over carpet, carpet tends to absorb any little screws or parts that you drop to be lost to the abyss. So a good tip would be to lay down a big old bed sheet on the ground and then put your chair on top of it, so if anything does roll off your work surface, it'll land on that towel instead of being sunken down into the carpet. Now, another really helpful tip is to just stay organized while you're building your kit. Inside of the kit, there are lots of little baggies, and they're going to be numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe A, B, C, whatever the case. They need to be opened in a particular order that's outlined in the manual. You do not want to just open all the bags at once. That's gonna be a nightmare of a build. It may be really helpful to get like a little pit mat or a screw catch so you can open up bag 1 and then bag 2 on a different side, and you can kind of keep your parts separated, as well as the hardware in the different screw catch spots. Some of these pit mats are even magnetized, so it will hold on to the screws and your other metal hardware to help prevent it from rolling around. Another way to do it, something that I've been doing for a long time when building kits, is using little paper plates. You can just put all of the bag A or bag 1 parts in a paper plate and then move on. Now, to build the RC kit, you're gonna need tools, of course. Most kits do include some generic tools with the kit. Of course, you're gonna need some hex drivers. Most kits include little L-shaped Allen wrenches. Those will work, but man, are they a pain in the butt, and they're just gonna hurt your hand after hours of using them. You'll probably also want to have some nut drivers. There is usually a generic nut driver included with the kit, and then having some needle nose pliers will be really handy. There are some other tools that are gonna make the job so much easier for you. One of them is gonna be an X-Acto knife. You're gonna also probably wanna have some blue thread locker on hand for any metal pieces, like a metal screw that screws into another metal piece. We're also gonna wanna have some sort of cleaner. You can use nitro cleaner, you can use isopropyl alcohol, or rubbing alcohol will work. Also some paper towels. And then the last 2 items are mainly for the shocks, like these shock shaft pliers are a lifesaver, and then some sort of shock stand. It's basically a stand with holes in it. Now, speaking of the shocks, if you're wanting to build your car with a particular setup to maybe mimic what a team driver had in his particular car for a similar track surface that you'll be racing on, that's something you want to have now with you while you're building the kit. Now, the last tip I have for you here before we start the build is to get your manual out. We want to just go through the first few pages, check out how the manual kind of lays out the steps. Notice how on the pages it may go from bag 1 to bag 2 or bag A, bag B. Another really crucial step to examining your manual is seeing how the manual outlays the hardware. In this particular manual, it actually has a flip out page that has all the hardware sizes that are used, so you can take a screw in your fingers and kind of line it up to the diagram for its actual size here. And you can use that as reference. You can leave this page out and then go through your manual. Not all manuals do it like this. Some manuals just have a column on the side showing what hardware. Some people actually use calipers to measure the screw to double check it's the right size. There's a lot of different ways and systems to go about it. You just want to ensure you find something that works for you so you're using the correct hardware. And I forgot to mention calipers earlier with the tools, but these are really handy to have when you build a kit. While you're building your steering parts, it's really important to pay attention to how freely the pieces move together. Here we have a steering rack and a bell crank, And as you can see, it is not moving smoothly at all. It should fall under its own weight. So all I'm gonna do is just back out this screw a little bit, and look at that. Now it moves freely under its own weight. Now, depending on what vehicle is being assembled, the parts are gonna be a lot different, but the principles are the same here. It doesn't matter if it's 8 scale or whatnot. As we're tightening up these pieces, we just wanna make sure that it stays smooth. All right, that is pretty smooth right there. All right, so we've come across the part in the manual where we have to put a metal and metal piece together, and we're gonna need a little bit of Loctite. So all I do with Loctite when I'm building a kit is you can take some and you just drop a little ball of it on a work surface or on a paper plate like this. So that Loctite right there will not harden up. Loctite doesn't actually get hard until it's void of all oxygen, like when you thread it into a hole and it's sealed up. When assembling sway bars, it's important that after you secure it to whatever is holding it in, that you check to make sure that that sway bar moves freely. And if it feels a little loose, tighten the screws up a little bit and then check again. We have a little ball cup here that's part of the steering assembly, and we're about to pop it on our ball stud. The point of this is that once we've popped it on, we want to make sure that it moves freely on that ball stud and there's no binding. So you can kind of see it's moving really free. Anytime a part is being held on by multiple screws, it's good to get the screws in each point, get the thread started and start feeding into the hole, but you don't want to tighten down any particular one location until you have all those screws started. And with a part that's being held on by 4 screws, kind of in a square almost, it's good to tighten them up in a star or a cross pattern. So you would start at one corner and then you can move on to the other corner, and then you would want to go diagonally to the other side and then over. So if you're mounting like a shock tower that usually takes 4 screws or so, it's good to tighten that up in a star pattern. With our suspension arms installed, we want to bring them up and make sure that they drop under their own weight. And there isn't much binding. You can tell there's a little bit of resistance because they're not immediately dropping, but that's just because some of the parts or all the parts are brand new. If you happen to find yourself with extra parts, that's okay as long as you've gone back and you've made sure that you did everything in those prior steps. With our steering block now secured onto the caster block, we want to verify that it moves freely without any bind or friction before we assemble it onto the suspension arms. Now with our caster block secured onto the suspension arms, we want to ensure that they move freely. On this particular buggy, there is a little bit of resistance there, but it's not bad and it'll wear in once we actually use the car. So anytime you come across assembling a gear differential, so instead of just putting this O-ring right in its location, I'm actually gonna take a little bit of the fluid and I'm just gonna coat the O-ring with it. But I'm just putting a little bit of fluid there, just kind of rubbing it in with my fingers and then plopping it in. Coating the O-ring also helps somewhat when you stick the outdrive through it, just to kind of help lubricate the O-ring so it doesn't get damaged, because if it tears or rips in any way, it's not good and will need to be replaced. And then sometimes working inside these diff cups can be kind of tight, so using some needle nose pliers to smush down any washers or install the pin that secures the outdrive in. And it's worth noting that if you're worried about bumping the table or having the differential fall over while it's sitting, you can use your shock stand to just set it in just like that. So now as long as you don't knock over the shock stand, you should be okay, but it's pretty solid. Now as we close up our differential with the 4 screws like we mentioned before, you want to tighten them up in a cross pattern. Here's a tip on bearings. Sometimes bearings included with the kit may have a seal on one side. Right here you can see this has a blue seal, but on the other side there is no seal, so that bearing is exposed to dirt and grime. So wherever bearings are used with a seal, that seal should be pointed out towards the outside. When it comes time to fully close up your diff or gearbox, if you're in an 8 scale, sometimes the manual will recommend to put a little grease on maybe the differential or the conical and the pinion gear. Now some guys even use shock fluid, but the idea is just to help lubricate the gearbox inside. Now this stuff is what I recommend. It's called Premier White. It's like a really silky grease that actually will also help keep the gearbox pretty quiet. So to apply this stuff, I'm just going to put it on the main diff gear and I'm gonna run it diagonally across a section. And then once the gears inside the gearbox have been spinning and moving a lot, the grease just tends to be distributed amongst all the gears in the gearbox. So let's try it. So something like that. That's just a nice cross section. So it hits the entire width of our gears here. And as we start running, like I said, it'll just distribute around. So here the gearbox is completely done and ready to be installed on the chassis. There's a few things to keep in mind. If you have a 10 scale buggy, sometimes they come with two different spur gears. One is for stock and one is for modified. Use the correct one for your intentions. And then second, once all of that is installed, give it a spin. Make sure everything seems smooth in the drivetrain. It's very, very important. And then lastly, it's good to just inspect that spur gear when you're spinning it and make sure it looks nice and true and it's straight and it's not kind of wallowing or wobbling around. If it's not straight, just pop it off, uninstall it, and then reinstall it again. See if that fixes it. When it comes time to build the turnbuckles, now there's a few things that can make the assembly of the ball cup a lot easier because they tend to be difficult. Sometimes those ball cups are just super tight on the turnbuckles. One trick that I like to do is just to add a little bit of grease onto the thread of the turnbuckle, just a little bit though, and that will make adding that turnbuckle on there a lot easier. There we go. Another thing that can be done to make this easier, there's a little tool. It's called the ball cup driver by Schaffner Racing, I believe, and it's kind of got a weird hole on here, the shape of a ball cup, so you could just put that on. Got a 1/4 inch tip here to put into like a screw gun, and you can use a power driver to put these turnbuckles on. But after adding grease, it's really not necessary. It just depends on your particular ball cups and the turnbuckles. You can also just use some needle nose pliers on the ball cup to help spin it around and tighten it, but it does kind of mar up the ball cup a little bit. This tool takes care of that and put the ball cup on there without any marring or anything. It looks perfect and brand new. And as you saw with the grease on there, I was actually just able to tighten it up with my hand. If they're too tight, what can happen is once you install it on the vehicle and then you use your wrench to adjust the turnbuckle, sometimes it'll pop the ball cup right off the ball stud. With the turnbuckles finally installed, it's good to do another check on those suspension arms. Make sure they move freely. You can usually give the turnbuckles a little twist like that and ensure they do not bind at all. And it's good to give the steering a try as well. Make sure that moves smoothly once those turnbuckles are installed. And then we'll just do the same on the back. The arms drop okay, no problem. This is also a good opportunity to get a feel for the drive shafts and the transmission, how smoothly it works. When it comes time to build the shocks, if your shock caps use a bleeder screw, it's really good to, before you build the shocks, to take that bleeder screw and then go and tap each hole in the cap because it just helps get the threads started. And it makes it a lot easier building the shocks if you've done that before you actually need to put the cap on. Now this only applies if you have plastic caps, and you need to also be careful with plastic caps to not over tighten this screw. So when building shocks, the shock shaft pliers are a huge lifesaver. They have little small notches kind of here towards the top, and that's where you'd want to slide your shock shaft in, and then you kind of just pinch it. Now you do not want to mar, scratch, indent this shock shaft at all. It needs to stay in pristine shape. When building the bottom shock area, there's a lot of O-rings and different pieces that go in here, and they're really sensitive pieces for the shock. So something that's really important to do is kind of lubricate those parts. I'm going to use Premier Blue. You can use shock fluid also if you want to. Our little silicone O-rings like this, we definitely want to. So I'm just gonna hold the O-ring in my hand, squirt a little of this Premier Blue in here, just kind of smush that grease all around that O-ring. Then I'm gonna continue to do that with every O-ring. We've loaded up the bottom of all of our shocks. They're all ready to go and have the bottom cap threaded on. This is one piece that's metal on metal that you do not want to Loctite. These caps only need to be finger tight. So now we're ready to push our shock shaft through the inside of our shock body and have it poke through the other side. We want to be really careful though that these threads on the shock shaft don't rip or mar or damage those O-rings inside at all. We did put Premier Blue on those O-rings. That is going to help lubricate it and also helps just kind of seal up that area. But before we shove this shock shaft through, we're just going to put some Premier Blue on there. Again, if you don't have Premier Blue, that's fine. Just use your silicone shock fluid. And it's important to push the shock shaft shaft down as straight as possible. And if you feel some resistance, don't just force it through. It should just gently glide through there. Now, there's a lot of ways you can bleed a shock. There's a lot of different methods that people have. If you want more information on that, there are some really good YouTube videos on how to build an RC shock. That's what I'd search. So the best thing to do with shocks is to just take your time, follow the instructions that are outlined in your manual, and if something feels off, you can always just do it again. Now, if you're building your shocks and they have a bleeder screw in the cap, it's gonna be a lifesaver if you have that bleeder screw on your driver ready to go. And then when you bleed the shocks, you wanna make sure that bleeder hole is at the top so that air wants to rise naturally and comes on out. If you have the hole in the backside, it's not gonna work so well. When it's time to put your springs on, if they're color coordinated, often they are, you can put that color at the top of your shocks so you can identify what shock springs you have later on. When it's time to install the shocks on the vehicle, attach the shock to the shock tower first, put the nut on or whatever system is used, tighten it down, and then just ensure that that shock moves freely. The bottom shock mount point at the suspension arm is less critical, but sometimes when you use a nut up on the shock tower to secure that shock cap, it can pinch the cap a little bit, causing a little bit of bind in the movement of the shock. And voila, just like that, this RC car kit is now a roller. So the kit itself is completely done. It just needs things like a Lexan body, tires and wheels, and then of course all of the electronics. But with the steps that we did, we know for a fact the steering is smooth, the suspension arms have no binding, the steering has no binding, the turnbuckles have no binding, the drivetrain has no binding, and this car should be ready to go. So building a kit isn't that difficult as long as you kind of stick with the manual, go along with the steps, and take your time. That's really important, not to rush it. But now that we've built and assembled this kit, had issues that we had to work through and correct, we know this kit really well now. And in the future, if we need to replace a broken part, do maintenance, upgrade something where we have to tear some parts apart, we'll know exactly what's needed and how to do it. And that really is one of the best reasons to build an RC car kit. So with that, I'm gonna leave you guys with this roller. If you have any questions on any of the stuff that we talked about today, please leave us a question down below. And if you would like more information, we'll put some links also in the description box of all the different products, tools, greases that we used in this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm Brett from AMain Hobbies. Thanks for watching.